Okay. All right. So this is the Garcia family tree. Um, and this is the family that we all know. There's Gigi, Julie, Katie, and John, and all the children of the respective Garcia kids, and your mother and father, of course. So we're going up the Garcia side of the tree, of course. And I haven't done the research on the Swanstroms. That will be coming soon. So I'm going to circle each person as they come up, and we're going to talk about each of them as they come up. So John Adrian Garcia Jr., my grandfather, Katie, Julie, Gigi, and John's father. That's the, the person we're tracing back from. So we're going to start with the oldest ancestor and work our back to the present. And so here is now the tracing of the ancestors back from John Adrian Garcia Jr. John Adrian Garcia Sr., his mother Virginia, his father of that was Charles Garcia and Felix Juan de Dios Garcia, and so forth and so on. So you just pause there for a moment. And here's Aunt Ginny and her husband, but we'll get to that in a minute. So that's the people we're going to be talking about. So what are we going to learn about in this presentation? We're going to learn about swamp railroads, extortion and old prostitutes, the derailment of the Texas Express, and payments from Joseph Stalin. So we're going to start with the oldest ancestor here, which is Felix Juan de Dios Garcia. But first, we're going to talk very briefly about Felix's father. Felix's father was Manuel Garcia, and this is the photo you might have seen in um, past Garcia family histories. That's actually Manuel, not Felix. Manuel was Felix's father. He served in the Spanish Coast Guard in the colony of West Florida. Florida at that time was divided into East Florida and West Florida, and both were owned by Spain in the late 1700s. And he was in the Coast Guard, searching for smugglers and pirates in the Gulf of Mexico. And in 1806, in fact, he bought land from the Spanish government. But the Louisiana Purchase had happened in 1803 when America bought that huge chunk of land from the French. And if you think back to your schooling, you think of the Louisiana Purchase. It kind of starts at New Orleans and goes north and west. It goes up the Mississippi River and then west from there. It was unclear in the treaties between Spain, America, and France who owned West Florida, and was it or was it not part of the Louisiana Purchase? So this dispute actually went up to the Supreme Court of the United States in 1838. There's a published case called Garcia versus Lee, and the court ruled that Spain did not own West Florida in 1806, so therefore it could not have sold land to Manuel Garcia. Manuel got shafted. Mr. Lee got the land. And West Florida is now basically the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, Alabama, and the areas near Pensacola, Florida. That was Manuel, his father, Felix's father. But let's talk about Felix. Felix was born in 1803 in New Orleans. We don't know a lot about his upbringing, but his father, Manuel, owned a plantation upriver from New Orleans, so he probably grew up rather wealthy. And by the late 1830s, so when he's about late 20s, he had become a railroad executive and the president of the Louisiana State Senate. So he was a state senator and the president of the Senate. And in 1837, he became the president of a company called the Mexican Gulf Railway Company. Now, 1837 is very, very early in the development of railroads. Um, the Transcontinental Railroad across the United States did not happen until the 1860s, 1870s, many, many years later. Railroads were not reliable or well run. Anyway, the Mexican Gulf Railroad Company raised money by selling stock to the public in New Orleans and by a loan from the local bank. and they built a very short line, I'm not sure why, through the swamp east of New Orleans out to a place called Shell Bank and Proctorville, and there's a fort out here on the coast. So that I've roughly traced the line of the railroad here in red. It didn't go to another city. It didn't go to anywhere particularly important or useful. It seemed to be sort of like a tourist railroad where you'd go out there and have a picnic and then go back to New Orleans. And on the right here, you see a newspaper advertisement for the Mexican Gulf Railroad Company. The fare was 75 cents. Children and slaves were 35 cents. And you could go out there to the Houses of Entertainment on Lake Borgon, owned by M. Garcia and Mr. Trim. But after 4 years of operations, they went under. I don't understand why they built this railroad line, but it didn't go anywhere productive. It didn't carry any freight really. Um, so they went broke. And now, curiously, the bank attempted to collect on its loan from the state government. I think because Felix had suggested, hey, I'm a state senator. If the if the railroad goes broke, the state government will pay you back. Don't worry about it. And then, of course, when the bank came to the state government and said, hey, we're owed this money by the Mexican Gulf Railroad Company, the state government said, not our problem. That's not the state government's debt. So anyway, there was a lot of sort of hemming and hawing and back and forth, and for several years there was hemming and hawing back and forth. Ultimately, the state government did indeed pay off the bank loan, seized the railroad, and then sold all of the assets of the railroad at auction. And so the company went under. Now, also, of course, he had inherited Manuel's sugar plantation, which was about 30 miles upriver from New Orleans. And you can see here on the map where it is. It's at this specific bend in the river called the Bonnet Carré part of the river, which I think means square hat in French. I think because this is sort of a squared off section of the river. Anyway, in 1849, a few years after the railroad had gone under, the the levee broke right next to the sugar plantation, and the sugar plantation was ruined. So poor Felix, his railroad had gone under, and his sugar plantation had been destroyed. But one interesting part of it is, although the plantation, of course, was worked by more than 100 slaves, Felix at one point proposed that the state government spend $1,000 for schools for black orphans. I think for the orphans of black citizens who had fought in the War of 1812. Um, and he spoke in favor of that in the state legislature. But it was voted down, sadly. And on the right here is a newspaper article talking about that debate. So Felix died in 1859 in Paris. His plantation was destroyed, the railroad was bankrupt, and as far as I can tell, he was kind of penniless, and that was the end of it. So that was Felix Juan de Dios Garcia. Now we're going to talk about Charles Garcia, his son. Charles Garcia was born in 1845 in New Orleans, and he was apparently the son of Felix and Felix's mistress. So Felix was married and had a wife at the plantation, um, but he also had a mistress in New Orleans, apparently named Magdalena Adrian. Anyway, in 1845 he was born, and the Civil War broke out around 1861. So Charles was only 16 years old, and he joined a local militia unit in the city of New Orleans called Beauregard's Rangers. And there were 4 or 5 of these units in New Orleans that weren't really, part of the real army, but they had guns and they would kind of march around and had uniforms and would do drills in the town square, and very much for show rather than really being in the army. Curiously, this is their unit on the right here. They wore blue uniforms because the Confederacy was not sort of a single thing. every unit could kind of pick its own uniform outfits, and they picked blue, which was more traditionally the Union colors than the Confederate gray. So he joined Beauregard's Rangers. It was composed of the wealthy sons of New Orleans plantation owners, and it was called the Kid Glove Regiment because, as I mentioned, they were just kind of drilling around the town for fun. But the Confederacy needed men, and they had ostensibly joined a militia unit. So the Louisiana forces were actually incorporated into the Confederate Army and shipped up to Tennessee by train. And in April of 1862, they fought at the Battle of Shiloh, which was a very bloody, terrible battle. And as you may know, New Orleans is known as the Crescent City. So Beauregard's Rangers and these other sort of irregular militia units were all sort of merged into a larger unit called the Crescent Regiment, named after the city of New Orleans, because they were all militia units from in and around New Orleans. And this is a picture of the Crescent Regiment monument at the Shiloh battlefield. And it's a little bit hard to see, but about 3/4 of the way down on the monument, you can see it says Bragg's Corps. That's named after General Bragg, the same general who's named after Fort Bragg in North Carolina. So anyway, Shiloh was a very bloody battle, and it was ultimately a Union victory. And after the battle, the Confederates were retreating south into Mississippi, and they were loading all their supplies onto a train to flee south. And Charles was ill for some reason, not sure what it was, and he was commanded to help load the train with the supplies. And Charles said, "No, I'm ill, I'm sick, I can't do it." And General Bragg himself came forward and said, "You will help load the train." And Charles said, "No, I will not." And so General Bragg directed a local platoon to take Charles over to a grove of trees and shoot him. And so they took him over to a grove of trees. He declined a blindfold. He handed his watch to the platoon leader and said, "Please give this to my family when after I'm dead." But for whatever reason, the platoon did not shoot him. It's not totally clear why that is, whether Bragg had said just make a show of it, or maybe the platoon leader lost his nerve. It's not clear, but he, at age 16, was fighting at the Battle of Shiloh and almost killed by firing squad. Pretty amazing. So after the Civil War, Charles moved to St. Louis. And in St. Louis, he married an Irish immigrant woman named Mary Connellan at the local Catholic church in 1869. So Charles then entered medical school around 1870 at the McDowell Medical College in St. Louis. This is a picture of the McDowell Medical College. After graduating from medical school, I think 3 or 4 years later, he became the chief surgeon at a facility called St. Mary's Infirmary of St. Louis, which is a very large hospital that served the whole city. So he was a big deal, and he was a very well-respected and skilled surgeon. But here's our first controversy. In 1877, a young woman named Susan Fortin, who worked at the same hospital, accused him of seducing her and forcing her to have an abortion, um, and sued him in criminal and civil court. So a big, huge controversy. And on the right here is a newspaper article about this. Other witnesses accused Susan Fortin of being a woman of loose morality, shall we say. And in the course of the case, various witnesses were charged by the DA with perjury for having lied about whatever they knew about this. Anyway, Charles, at one point, as the case progressed, was charged with disturbing the peace after he threatened to shoot Susan's mother, calling her an old prostitute while he was pushing her off the sidewalk. So that's our first scandalous moment in the Garcia family history. Now, At one point, Susan's attorney wrote to Charles saying she'll take $10,000 to keep quiet about this. And if you don't pay the money, we're going to publish all of these accusations and make them public and embarrass you. And Charles called the bluff. He had the demand letter published in the newspaper. And then he had his own response published as well, calling it a scheme to extort money from him. And then ultimately, about a month later, Susan Fortin had not paid the court costs uh, for the lawsuit that she had filed, and the case was dismissed. So the whole thing went away, and I don't know if we would call that an exoneration, but he did not pay this woman for her silence. Now, unfortunately, Charles had asthma or tuberculosis. It's not totally clear, and so he traveled through various Western states in the 1880s, seeking cleaner air, as they used to do back in that era. And he was in Fort Worth, Texas in 1889 when he died. He died in a hotel in downtown Fort Worth, and his body was shipped back to St. Louis by train for burial. And he died at only age 45. And he's buried at the Cavalry Cemetery in St. Louis, which is actually across the street from the Bellefontaine Cemetery, where many of the Wolffs and the Ramsey family are buried. So there's a lot of St. Louis connection. That was Charles Garcia. Now we're going to talk about Margaret Mary Connellan, the Irish immigrant who married Charles. Margaret Mary Connellan was born in 1842 in Ireland in a very tiny village called Boulogne, I think it's called, in Galway, which is sort of the west central part of Ireland. And their family immigrated to America through New York, but I'm not sure why, but they went all the way further west to St. Louis. And her father and her brothers operated a saloon in St. Louis. And she married Charles Garcia, as we mentioned earlier, and they had 6 sons named Felix, Charles, John Adrian, Manuel, Eugene, and Leon. And Charles was a rather successful and wealthy doctor working at the St. Mary's Infirmary, and he had a house built for himself, a large 3-story house with multiple servants. And this image that we see here is, in fact, the house on the corner of 13th Street in St. Louis. It's from an old sort of 3-dimensional atlas that cities used to have made. So that's the actual house. So Margaret Mary Connellan had 6 sons. 2 of them, Felix and Leon, became doctors like their father Charles. 3 of them became dentists, Charles, Manuel, and Eugene, and only one, John, became an engineer. And she lived until 1907, and she was buried also with Charles Garcia in Calvary Cemetery in St. Louis. So now we're going to talk about John Adrian Garcia, the son of Charles and Margaret Mary. So John Adrian Garcia Sr., he wasn't obviously called senior at the time, but I'm going to use that for specificity here. He was born in 1876. He was the third born of the 6 sons, and he graduated in 1895 from St. Louis University. He was only 19 years old, so very advanced, as it were. All of his brothers became doctors or dentists, as we mentioned, but he instead went to the Missouri School of Mines, which is located in Rolla, Missouri, which is sort of west central Missouri, and I've marked it on the map here. And it was founded by the state in the mid 1800s near what were lead ore deposits. So the state wanted to exploit those deposits and needed mining engineers to do that. In 1900, he graduated from Missouri School of Mines with a Bachelor of Science in Mining Engineering. And up at the top right here, you can see his senior thesis was treatment of a silver ore by sodium hyposulfite and Russell solution. Um, so it was something about refining silver. But he didn't leave school. He stayed at Missouri School of Mines to get a master's degree, which he earned 3 years later in 1903. And while he was still in progress of getting his mining master's degree, he married a local resident named Virginia C., who lived there in Rolla, the same town as the school. And after graduating from the Missouri School of Mines, he became the chief engineer at the Deering Coal Company in southern Illinois. It's not often well known, but under Illinois, under all that farmland, is a large uh, deposit of coal. Um, so he was the chief engineer for one of the many coal companies in sort of south central state of Illinois. In 1910, he moved to Chicago and he co-founded Allen and Garcia Company. And Allen and Garcia Company seemed to have specialized in building what are called tipple. And on the right here, you see what is a tipple. It's this huge structure that's up on the surface, this white building here. And railroad cars would come underneath the tipple, and through a system of conveyor belts and chutes and machinery, it would drop the coal into the railroad cars so that the coal could then be carried by railroad to another location. So that was one of their specializations. So I'm going to show you briefly here. I found some footage from the 20s, so a little bit later than when he worked for the Deering Coal Company, of one of these mines. So hopefully,
My wife said, if you win, we'll fly to Asia. If I win, we'll fly to Paris.
describe.
I bet you won't get toned with just...
All right, so here's the Deering Coal Company in El Dorado, Illinois. So that's the tipple. You can see this big, huge structure, and you can sort of see the railroad cars underneath it. And there's a conveyor belt, carrying the coal into the tipple that they brought up from below. These are various gentlemen working at the coal company. I don't think any of them are John Garcia, though. Okay, so back to the presentation. So Allen and Garcia really prospered in the early 1900s with mining projects across America and overseas. Because we know that because in 1920 he applied for his passport to work at a coal mine in Coahuila, Mexico, which is just south of Texas. And here's our next big reveal for the presentation. In 1926, Allen and Garcia became consulting engineers for coal mining to the Soviet Union. And this is in an era when the Soviet Union was not even recognized as the government of Russia at the time until many years later. So we'll talk more about that. In Ukraine, which of course at that time was part of the Soviet Union, and the eastern half of Ukraine in an area called Donetsk has a lot of hard coal. So the coal that burns clean and strong and doesn't produce a lot of smoke and so forth. And they have a lot of hard coal. But during the Russian Civil War, which had just ended a few years earlier, most of Russian industry was really devastated by the Civil War. Not only were things physically destroyed, but the people that operated these industries had all fled Russia because they were, the educated and the wealthy who the Soviets distrusted and deemed to be, traitors to the Soviet people and so forth. So the Soviet government in the early 20s needed to rebuild all kinds of industries, textiles, agriculture, mining, all sorts of things, but they didn't have the expertise to rebuild their industrial base. So Lenin died in 1924 and Stalin took over shortly thereafter. And in the late 1920s, Stalin invited Western companies to come build factories inside the USSR. So for example, you say to Ford Motor Company, come build a factory that makes automobiles outside of Moscow, sell your Ford Motor Company cars to Russians, and we'll split the profits or something like that. Well, can you really trust Joseph Stalin? Not so much. They would come and they would build these factories in the early 20s, and then shortly thereafter, the Russians would seize the factory. It's communism, of course. So, or alternatively, the managers of these factories were arrested for counter-revolutionary activities and put on show trials. Some of them were deported back to their countries, and some of them were actually shipped to the Gulag. So, in light of that, a lot of these Western companies said, no thanks, we don't want to build a factory in Russia. Thank you very much. But the Russians still wanted their help, so they shifted to arrangements where the Russians would just pay cash. They would say, come to Russia, teach us how to, set up a factory, and we'll pay you $1 million. It'll be a Russian-owned, Russian-operated factory, but we'll have you help us set it up. So that's exactly what Allen and Garcia was doing. They were paid to provide on-site assistance to these Ukrainian coal mines in the Donetsk region and to train Soviet engineers in American mining methods. So on the right here, you can see this is from an academic paper I located. Allen and Garcia was given a 3-year contract in 1927 to build several coal mines in the Donetsk region, and then a second contract in 1929. And they actually brought some Soviet engineers to America to train under Allen and Garcia as well. So this is a newspaper article from May of 1927 from the New York Times, talking in detail about the fact that John A. Garcia is leaving for Russia to introduce American methods in the Donetsk coalfield. So John Garcia Sr. left America and traveled to Russia to live in Russia uh, at a time when, the Russian Civil War had just ended, Lenin had just died, Stalin had just taken over. A very sort of unsettled and risky thing to do, but that's what he did. So they lived in a compound next to the mine in an American, village essentially that the Russians had built for these American mining engineers with little American houses and some of these mining engineers had brought their families, so they built a school for the kids. They had all sorts of, it was just this little American colony inside eastern Ukraine in the late 1920s. And what we found here is some newsreel footage. It goes on for many different, they're talking about many different American industries helping Russians. So it goes on for, I think, for more than an hour. I've skipped to just the part where they're talking about the coal mining. So I'm gonna watch that.
Now on the left bank of the river has been formed a great industrial combine utilizing the power created by the dam.
The mining engineer.
At Donetsk Basin we find the headquarters of the American engineers. At this point there are vast deposits of coal and iron, rock salt and manganese. These men give not only their advice but their vast store of knowledge gained through experience and their time. For years they worked shoulder to shoulder with the Russians to develop these natural resources.
Here's all the engineers at their drafting table next to the coal mine. And this is the little village they built
Russia,
for the Americans to live in.
Colony. The homes are built by Americans. They have their own schools and churches and apartment houses.
I have no idea if this is still in Ukraine.
The children play American games. And because of the many years spent here, life takes on the aspect of an average American community.
Eastern Ukraine while their dad works at the coal mine.
Healthy, robust children.
Playing badminton or something. I don't know what they're doing.
And jovial.
And the dads sit around and they smoke. Anyway, that is where John Adrian Garcia Sr. was in the late 1920s. And then we know from shipping records that he came back to America in the late 20s on the Italian ocean liner SS Roma. On the right here, that's a picture of the Roma. And we know that from the shipping records, he came back with his family. So it's not totally clear to me whether the family had gone with him to Ukraine and lived there with him for several years, or if they just met him in Italy and then they sailed back together. So he was also awarded an honorary doctorate of engineering in 1928 from the Missouri School of Mines. This is the graduation program from June of 1928 with his picture on the cover. And as I mentioned earlier, the tipples were the specialization of Allen and Garcia Company. This is a mine in Wyoming, a tipple that was built by Allen and Garcia in 1936, which still exists today. It's outside of town of Reliance, Wyoming. Um, and Allison's question, this is Katie Julie Gigi's grandfather. Yes, this is John A. Garcia Sr. This mine closed in 1955 when coal mining was no longer needed to fuel the steam locomotives, and they shifted to diesel locomotives. But you can still tour an Allen and Garcia tipple if you wanted to, if you got yourself to a remote section of Wyoming. So John Adrian Garcia Sr., he died in 1939 from a fall at home at age 63. Gigi was born 3 years later, so he didn't meet any of his grandchildren. And he's buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago. So now we're going to shift over to the other side of the family, the Steed, or I think that's how it's pronounced. I'm not totally sure. The Says. And we're going to start with Edward Austin Say. He was born in 1834 near Lynchburg, Virginia, and the family moved just 1 year later to central Missouri, and they were farmers. And they had 11 children. Um, but he did not want to be a farmer. And at age 19, he started studying law in a town called Steelville, Missouri, with the local judge named Judge Pomeroy. And at that time, there wasn't really law school. You just kind of apprenticed to a good lawyer or a judge and sort of practice at being a lawyer for a couple of years. And then eventually, and there was no bar exam either. And then eventually the judge would say, okay, I deem you now to be a lawyer, and off you go. And so Edward, once he was deemed to be a lawyer, was both a prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney. And in 1866, he petitioned the state of Missouri, to remove the local judge, Judge Aaron von Warmer, for incompetence. But what does that really mean? So we looked further into that, and it turned out, of course, in the 1860s, the Civil War happened. And after the 1860s Civil War is over, there's a question of the loyalty and the adherence to the Constitution of the former Confederates, and many Confederates were forced to basically swear a loyalty oath, basically saying, "I will never do that again. We will never again uh, engage in treason or sedition against the United States government," and they can be reinstated to their various professional positions. Now, Edward had been excused from taking the loyalty oath, evidently because he had not served in the Confederate Army. But later, Judge Van Warmer said, "No, actually, I do want you to take the oath. I think you are a rebel sympathizer. So maybe not a Confederate soldier specifically, but in league with them." And Edward was shocked, horrified, and dismayed that he was being asked to take such an oath, and asked the state to remove the judge. Uh, it doesn't make sense to me that he could have just said, "Okay, fine, I'll take the oath, whatever." But anyway, it became a big to-do. Now, the Texas Express, we mentioned that earlier. In 1877, 5 men were accused of derailing the Texas Express, which ran from Texas up to St. Louis, outside the town of Richland, Missouri, on a dark and stormy night. They put some logs on the rails, and the train derailed. And the wreck killed 3 men. It killed the engineer, the fireman, and one passenger. And they evidently intended to rob the train because they shot pistols into the train cars after they derailed and the passengers were streaming out of the train after the wreck. So for the five defendants, Edward was part of the criminal defense team. For the first defendant who was tried by the state for, attempted murder and train derailment and so forth, um, the first defendant was acquitted at trial. So Edward C. was successful in defending this man from the charges. And because they couldn't convict the first guy, the state just ultimately decided to drop the charges against the other four. So he helped defend those accused of derailing the Texas Express. This was the same era, roughly speaking, of Jesse James and all the more famous train robbers in the West. Edward was also a politician. He was elected to the Missouri State Senate in 1874 and to the House of Representatives in 1888. He ran for lieutenant and he ran for U.S. Congress as well, but he did not win those races. But he served in the state government. He died in 1895 at age 61, and he's buried with his wife in a cemetery in Salem, Missouri, which is in central Missouri. So let's talk about Edward Austin C's wife, Evelyn Gracia Pomeroy. She was born in 1844 in Plymouth, Indiana. Her family moved then to central Illinois. And so she was the daughter of Judge Pomeroy, the same judge who was, the sort of the teaching Edward C. how to become a lawyer. But she was only 10 years old when Edward started studying law, and she was only 16 years old when Edward married her. So I don't know exactly what was going on. I think he was studying law while he was checking out uh, uh, Evelyn Pomeroy as well. Uh, Edward at the time, to answer Allison's question, Edward at the time was something like 20 years old, so older, um, and she was quite young, but it was a different time. And they married at the Virginia Hotel in St. Louis, which was a little bit of a ways away from central Missouri, so it must have been sort of a big to-do and maybe part of their honeymoon, I'm not sure. Edward and Evelyn had 9 children. Virginia May C., born in 1871, was the 6th child. And they seem to have been fairly wealthy at one time uh, because they had 2 servants in the 1870 census. He died in 1904 at age 60, again buried with her husband in Salem, Missouri. So now we're going to talk about Virginia May C., um, Katie, Julie, Gigi, John's grandmother, um, and the child of Edward and Evelyn. She was born in Rolla, Missouri in 1876. She was the 6th of 9 children. And you remember Rolla is where the Missouri School of Mines was located. So that's where John Adrian Garcia Sr. met her in Rolla. And they married at the Catholic Church in 1902 when he was still finishing his master's degree at the Missouri School of Mines. And they had 2 children, John Adrian Garcia Jr. and Virginia May Garcia, and Ginny. So John Sr. again died in 1939, and Virginia moved in with her daughter, uh, Virginia May Garcia, and Ginny in the Chicago suburbs. So she died in 1957 at age 81, and she is also buried at the Oakwood Cemetery in Chicago. John and Virginia, yeah, John and Virginia did have 2 kids named John and Virginia, exactly. Not only Virginia May C. became Virginia May Garcia, and their daughter was named Virginia May Garcia. Yes, you're exactly right, named after themselves. So now we're going to talk briefly about John Adrian Garcia Jr., Katie, Julie, Gigi, and John's father. Um, John Sr. had married in 1902 in Rolla and finished his graduate degree at the Missouri School of Mines in 1903. John Jr. was born in Warrensburg, Missouri, which is in the western part of the state near Kansas City. That's probably where John Sr. at the time was working at a mine. It's the only reason I can think of why they would have been in Warrensburg. Not clear to me whether he did or didn't travel with his father to Ukraine, to those coal mines. He would have been over 20 years old at that point, so probably unlikely, but I don't know. So when John Sr. died in 1939, John Jr. was only 35 years old, and he took over his father's position at Allen and Garcia, which continued to prosper and design coal mining structures. This is from an academic article talking about John Garcia in 1952 presenting plans for a coal mine in Waltonville, Illinois. And of note, for the Wolff side of the family, uh, in building those coal mine structures, he was using equipment from Alice Chalmers. He died in 1976 at age 71 in Spruce Pine. And now we're going to talk briefly about Virginia May Garcia, who we know as Aunt Ginny, of course. She was born in 1909, the younger sister of John Jr., and she married a guy named, this is a very unique name, Joseph Pulitzer McCarthy. So Joseph Pulitzer, you know, the famous newspaper person. Joseph McCarthy, the famous red-baiting congressman. So when you put Joseph Pulitzer McCarthy into Google, it gets deeply confused as to what you're trying to do. I was able to find a little bit about him. He was a newspaper reporter who apparently worked on gangster stories about John Dillinger and others in the 30s. Um, but they married in 19, he married Aunt Ginny in 1935 in New York, but less than 5 years later they had been divorced. He remarried and moved to New York and died at age 58 in 1972. Did not seem to have any other kids. I wasn't able to actually find in the divorce records of Aunt Ginny and Joseph Pulitzer McCarthy, but we know that McCarthy did remarry, which is a little strange. So hopefully Mr. McCarthy didn't engage in bigamy and remarry without first formally divorcing Aunt Ginny. Aunt Ginny lived with her mother in the Chicago suburbs until her mother's death in 1957, and then she died 40 years after that and is buried at the St. Gregory Episcopal Church in Deerfield, Illinois. So this is their short, small burial garden and the plaque that is for Aunt Ginny. So to recap, what we've learned is Manuel Garcia chased pirates for the Spanish royal government in the early 1800s and got cheated out of land that he was owed, that he purchased from the Spanish government but never got. His son Felix Garcia founded a railroad that went through a swamp and failed almost immediately. Um, Charles Garcia was a Confederate soldier and a wealthy surgeon in St. Louis who fought off extortion attempts from a younger woman. And John Garcia Sr. was paid by Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union to rebuild Ukrainian coal mines in the late 1920s. And Edward C. was a suspected Confederate sympathizer and criminal defense attorney who defended train robbers. I've built a map where you can see all of these places, um, and I'll share this link with you, and it links all of the various spots, either homes or plantations or the spot of the birthplace of someplace, something like that. And I'm not going to go through it all here, but if you are interested, there are 3 very interesting things to follow up on your own time if you'd like to. This is an academic paper about all of the efforts by various American companies to rebuild Soviet industries, whether it was textiles or agriculture or uh, you know, chemicals or whatever it may be. And they mention Allen and Garcia, amongst others. Uh, this next one is a more detailed description of the derailment of the Texas Express and all the circumstances of the attempted robbery and then the following trial that went on of the train robber gang. And this last here is 3 YouTube links. Again, that's the long newsreel style footage that some other mining engineer had taken when they were traveling around Ukraine. They would stop at each town and take a 10-minute newsreel footage of each town that they stopped in. And these 3 links are the sections I think you would find most interesting, either talking about coal mining or it's the same footage we saw earlier where there's American engineers living in a little American village in eastern Ukraine. That's it. If anybody has more questions, I've set up a second Google Meeting link, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. So that's the end of part 1. The Swanstroms are coming soon. And then there's a whole lot of slides here. I'll send you guys the link. There's a whole lot of slides of like stuff that I thought was maybe irrelevant or not that interesting or unconfirmed. This is of minor interest. Felix Garcia got a patent in 1861, posthumously actually, for refining sugar. But there's all kinds of other stuff about here about maybe interesting to you. And that's it.